Adeline Marlowe pressed the auction number into the auctioneer's hand with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking, then walked back to Rosewood and buried her face against the mare's neck so nobody in that yard could see her cry. She was selling her dead father's last horse. Not because she wanted to, because $42 and a pile of debt notices had backed her into a corner so tight she couldn't breathe. The horse her father had named himself, the horse he'd loved more than the ranch, more than money, almost as much as he'd loved her. If this story already has your heart, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single moment of what happens next. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Valley, Arizona Territory, and the morning. Adeline Marlowe discovered that losing everything was only the beginning. The auction yard was already loud by the time Adeline got there, and loud was the last thing she needed. She'd been awake since before dawn, lying on the narrow cot in the back room of the Red Valley boarding house, staring at the ceiling and running numbers in her head, the way she'd been running them every night for 8 months. What she owed, what she had, what the gap between those two figures was going to cost her. The gap hadn't changed. It never changed. It just sat there in the dark, like something with weight and patience waiting for her to stop pretending she could outthink it. She'd gotten up at 4, dressed in the dark, and gone to the livery stable to spend an hour with Rosewood before the day began. She'd told herself she was going to check the mare's legs, make sure she was moving well, run through the grooming one more time, so the horse showed at her absolute best when the bidding started. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason. The real reason was that she needed one more hour that still felt like hers. She'd stood in the stall with her forehead resting against Rosewood's neck, one hand moving slowly along the mare's shoulder, and she'd talked to her the way she'd been talking to horses since she was old enough to form sentences quietly, honestly, with the understanding that the animal was listening, even if it couldn't answer back. "You're going to be all right," she'd told the mare. "Whoever buys you is going to know what they have. You're too good not to be seen." Rosewood had pressed her nose against Adeline's collarbone, warm and steady and unhurried the way she always did when she was offering something back. Adeline had stayed until the light started to change. Now she was here in the noise and the dust and the smell of too many horses and too many people packed into a space that felt smaller every minute, and she was doing what she'd learned to do in the past 8 months, when everything inside her was coming apart. She was keeping her face still and her spine straight and not giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her break. The Marlowe name still meant something in Red Valley. It meant something different than it used to, but it still meant something. A year ago, that name had meant the finest horse bloodline in the territory. A family operation built across 3 generations. A ranch that serious buyers traveled hundreds of miles to visit. Now it meant something else. Now it meant a story people told at the edges of conversations. Something cautionary, something sad. The way people talked about things that had gone wrong as a way of reassuring themselves that the same thing wouldn't happen to them. She could hear it in the way voices dropped when she passed. She could see it in the way eyes moved away a half-second too quickly. The Marlowe situation, they called it, and they said it the way people said the weather, inevitable, regrettable. Nobody's fault in particular. Her father had not been a careless man. That was what nobody seemed willing to say out loud. Nathaniel Marlowe had been one of the most deliberate, methodical, careful businessmen in Arizona Territory. A man who checked his figures twice and kept records that a bank examiner could have read without confusion. He had not been naive. He had not been reckless. He had not made the kinds of mistakes that ended in foreclosure. And yet, here she was. She'd been over it so many times that the facts had worn grooves in her thinking deep and familiar as wheel ruts in a road she'd traveled too often. November. Her father's death. Sudden, the doctor said. Just his heart, as though a heart were a small thing. December, the first letter from the Tucson bank. A loan she hadn't known about, a figure that made her sit down hard in her father's chair because her legs had stopped working properly. January, February. The back and forth with bankers who spoke to her in the patient, slightly louder voices. People used with someone they'd decided wasn't quite capable of understanding the attorney in Flagstaff, who'd looked at the documents and shrugged with the specific quality of a man who had already decided the outcome before he'd finished reading. "Miss Marlowe," the attorney had said, setting the papers down on his desk and folding his hands over them like he was putting something to bed. "I understand this is difficult to accept, but the documentation appears to be in order." "It isn't in order," she'd said. "My father didn't take this loan. I know every financial arrangement he had. I kept half these books myself." The attorney had given her a look she'd come to know well in those months. Not unkind exactly, but this specific variety of patience meant extended to women who were saying true things in situations where the truth was inconvenient. "Grief can make it difficult too. I'm not talking about grief," she'd said, and her voice had come out harder than she'd intended, with an edge that had made him sit back slightly. "I'm talking about a signature I don't recognize on a document I've never seen, for an amount that makes no sense, given everything I know about how my father ran his business. I'm asking you to look at it carefully." He hadn't looked at it carefully. He'd referred her to someone else who'd referred her to someone else, and the whole chain of referrals had run out eventually, like a creek that disappears into dry ground, leaving her exactly where she'd started, except with less time and less money, and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been fighting a battle with no clear opponent. March the ranch hands leaving, not all at once, which might have felt like something she could respond to, but one by one, quietly, with apologies that were genuine and helpless in equal measure. Tom Briggs, who'd worked for her father for 12 years, had come to her with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the expression of a man about to say something he'd been dreading. "I got a family, Miss Marlowe," he'd said. "I got 3 kids. I can't. I waited as long as I could. I want you to know that." "I know, Tom," she'd said. "I know." She hadn't asked him to stay. It wouldn't have been right to ask him. April through June. The horses. Her father's horses. The animals he'd spent 30 years breeding toward a standard of excellence that most people in the business couldn't even clearly articulate, sold off in transactions that felt less like auctions and more like seizures. Not at fair market value. Not with the care and deliberateness her father had always brought to placing his animals. Quickly, efficiently to buyers who appeared with cash and paperwork, and the unhurried confidence of people who knew they were getting something for less than it was worth and had made their peace with that. She'd tried to stop it. She'd argued with the bank's representatives, had contacted buyers directly, had written 4 letters to the Territorial Land Office that had gone unanswered. She'd spoken to every person she could think of who'd had a relationship with her father, looking for someone who would look at what was happening and say what she was thinking. Most of them hadn't. One of them had come close, old Harrison Pruitt, who'd bought horses from her father for 15 years and had the decency to look genuinely troubled when she'd laid out the situation for him in his kitchen over coffee he hadn't touched. "Adeline," he'd said, finally turning his cup in his hands. "What you're describing, if you're right about it, that's not something one person can fight alone. I'm not asking for someone to fight it with me," she'd said. "I'm asking for someone to say out loud that what I'm seeing is real." He'd been quiet for a long moment. "What you're seeing is real," he'd said at last quietly, like a man saying something he wasn't sure it was safe to say. "But that don't mean I know what to do about it." It had been the most honest conversation she'd had in 6 months. By July, the ranch was gone. She'd stood in the yard of the property her grandfather had homesteaded, and her father had built into something worth building, and she'd understood for the first time what the word dispossessed actually felt like from the inside. Not like loss exactly, which implied something accidental, but like being unmade, like having the ground underneath the story of yourself removed so that the story had nothing left to stand on. She'd kept Rosewood. Kept her because legally, she could demonstrate the mare had been hers independently. A birthday gift from her father 3 years prior, with the paperwork to prove it. Kept her because Rosewood was the last remaining animal from the breeding program. Her father had built the last living thread of the legacy someone had worked very hard to erase. Kept her because she was the last thing in the world that still felt like home. She'd spent the summer in Red Valley boarding the mare at Murphy's Livery for a rate she'd negotiated down to something she could almost afford. Working whatever jobs presented themselves. Seamstress work, bookkeeping for a merchant on the main street, 2 weeks helping the doctor's wife with correspondence when that lady had been ill. She'd asked twice for work at ranches in the area. Both times, she'd been turned down, with the particular polite regret of men who had decided before the conversation started that what she was offering wasn't what they needed. What she was offering was the best horse management knowledge in the territory. What she didn't have was the patience to pretend she understood why that wasn't enough. The livery bill had come due last week. The boarding house was 2 weeks behind. The seamstress work had dried up with the season. The merchant's books were balanced, and he didn't need her anymore. $42, a stack of notices, 1 horse. She'd run the numbers every way she knew how, and they kept coming up the same. She was standing at the far end of the holding pen, one hand flat on Rosewood's shoulder when she first noticed the man watching from the fence. Not the way people had been watching her all morning. The quick glances, the whispered conversations at the edge of her hearing, the particular social avoidance of people who found someone else's misfortune uncomfortable to witness directly. This was different, steadier, more focused. Howe was leaning against the top fence rail with his arms folded, and he was looking at Rosewood with the concentrated attention of someone who was actually seeing the animal, rather than performing the act of looking. He had the stillness of a man who'd spent years doing difficult things outdoors, and had arrived somewhere past the need to prove it to anyone. Good hat, plain clothes hands that had done real work. Somewhere in his mid-30s. Howe wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the horse. After a moment, he said without shifting his gaze, "She one of Nathaniel Marlowe's?" "She is," Adeline said. "Last one." "Thought I recognized the build." A pause. The pause of someone thinking, rather than filling space. "I bought a pair of Marlowe horses 4 years back. Best working animals I've run in 20 years of ranching. Still got them. Don't have the heart to part with them even now they're past heavy work." Something loosened slightly in Adeline's chest. Not relief, she wasn't sure she had access to relief today, but something adjacent to it, the feeling of an unexpected kindness. "My father would have been glad to hear that." "I was sorry to hear about his passing," said simply without performance, and left there without elaboration. "Thank you." He turned then and looked at her directly, and his gaze had the same quality as his attention on the horse. Honest observing without the evaluating quality she'd learned to brace for in situations like these. "Wesley Carter," he said. She knew the name. Carter Ranch was one of the most respected operations in the territory, built over a decade into something that commanded real regard from people who knew the business. Adeline Marlowe. A brief acknowledgement crossed his face. "I know." He looked back at Rosewood. "She as good as she looks. She's better," Adeline said, and there was no performance in it, just the plain truth. "Finest horse in this yard today, and likely the finest in this county. Spanish Barb bloodline on the sire's side. Her dam had the best temperament my father ever bred for. Rosewood has her mother's disposition, and her sire's conformation, and a memory I've never seen matched in any horse I've worked with. She learns a pattern in 3 repetitions, and holds it for years." He nodded slowly. "What's her price?" She named it. The number she'd calculated, not what the horse was worth, because she couldn't ask what the horse was worth without the bid stalling, but what she needed to clear her debts and have something to begin with. "That's a fair number," he said. "It's a low number," she said, and caught herself because she hadn't meant to say that. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "It is." She heard Clayton Whitaker before she saw him, the particular quality of movement through a crowd that expected to part for it, and was usually right. He arrived the way he always arrived, smooth and unhurried, with a smile that had been calibrated over years to land just short of too much. "Miss Marlowe." He tipped his hat. "Didn't expect to see you here today." She'd known Clayton Whitaker was going to be here. She'd known it, and she'd prepared herself for it, but preparation and reality had a gap between them that she felt now in her stomach, cold and specific. "Mr. Whitaker." He looked at Rosewood with the performance of seeing something for the first time, when in fact she knew with a certainty that had no evidence she could point to, and no need of any, that he'd been calculating this horse's value for months. "Lovely animal," he said. "Your father's pride and joy, I always heard. She's a good horse." The smile stayed exactly where it was. "I'd like to help you out today, Miss Marlowe. I know things have been difficult. No one would blame you for that, losing your father the way you did. And I'm prepared to make you a private offer before the bidding starts. Save you the trouble and uncertainty of the floor." He named a number. She almost laughed. It was so far below what she'd just said to Wesley Carter that for a half-second she thought she'd misheard. She hadn't misheard. "No," she said. "Miss Marlowe, I'm only trying to—" "No." She looked at him directly, and she let him see in her face exactly how clearly she understood what he was doing. "Rosewood goes to auction." Something moved behind his eyes. The smile didn't change, but behind it, something did the slight shift of a man recalibrating, moving from one approach to another, the way water moves around an obstacle. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Though I've been hearing some things, questions being raised about the Marlowe bloodline documentation, whether the records are fully in order. Nothing I've raised myself, you understand. Just things circulating. These rumors affect buyer confidence, affect what people are willing to pay. I'd hate to see you walk away with less than you need." She understood him completely then. Every word of it. She understood that he had started those rumors himself, or had someone start them, that he'd done it this morning before the auction opened specifically to soften the bidding on this horse, so that when she couldn't get a real price for Rosewood, she'd have nowhere left to turn but back to him. He had done this. He had planned this. And he was standing in front of her telling her about it in language, smooth enough that she couldn't call it what it was, without sounding like a desperate woman making accusations. She felt the rage move through her like cold water. "Get away from my horse," she said, quietly, completely. He raised both hands, the gesture of a reasonable man who couldn't imagine what he'd done wrong. "Now, Miss Marlowe, she told you no." Wesley Carter's voice came from directly behind her right shoulder. She hadn't heard him move, and from the way Whitaker's expression rearranged itself, Whitaker hadn't either. Carter hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. There was something in the quality of it, not a threat, not bluster, just the voice of a man who had enough standing in this territory that saying a thing was sufficient without needing to escalate it. Whitaker looked at him for 2 seconds, running whatever calculation he ran. Then the smile broadened, accommodating, pleasant. The smile of a man who had decided this particular moment wasn't worth the investment. "Wesley," he said, "didn't see you there. Just looking out for the young lady, that's all." "She doesn't need it," Carter said. "Enjoy the auction." It was a dismissal. Not aggressive. There was no aggression in it, but as final as a closed door. Whitaker held the smile for one more beat, looked at Adeline with an expression that managed to convey both pleasantness and a kind of patient promise, and then he was gone, moving back into the crowd with the ease of a man who had been temporarily inconvenienced and had a great deal of time. Adeline let out a slow breath. "He seeded the room before we got here," she said. She wasn't asking. "He did," Carter said. "I watched him do it. 15 minutes, 3 separate conversations." He paused. "He's been running this kind of operation for 2 years. Buys from people going through hard times, always for a fraction of value, always after the value's been softened first." She turned to look at him. "What do you know about him?" 6 ranches in 3 years, he said. "All from people with financial troubles that don't quite add up when you look at them carefully. All with paperwork that appeared legitimate, but left questions a better attorney might have asked." He looked at her steadily. "Your father was the most careful businessman I knew of in this territory, Miss Marlowe. The debt that ended his ranch doesn't match the man." The air left her. It was the first time in 8 months that anyone had said it. The thing she had been saying to attorneys and bankers and land office clerks, who had all looked at her with various flavors of patient dismissal. The thing she had been carrying alone, turning over in her hands in the dark of the boarding house ceiling at 4 in the morning, wondering if she was wrong, wondering if grief was distorting her judgment the way everyone kept implying it was, said plainly. Said as fact. By a man who had no reason to say it that she could identify except that it was true. "People keep telling me I didn't understand his business as well as I thought," she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady. "People say convenient things," he said. The auctioneer's voice cracked across the yard before she could answer, calling the crowd to order, and she turned back to Rosewood and put her hand flat against the mare's neck and felt the steady warmth of the animal under her palm, and she made herself breathe. She led Rosewood into the ring, the way her father had taught her, straight-spined, no performance, just presence. Let the horse speak. Rosewood did. She moved with the fluid, unhurried ease that was her particular signature ears-forward expression. Curious, every line of her announcing exactly what she was to anyone with the knowledge to read it. The opening bids came in low. She'd expected it. She kept her face still. Around the ring she could see the small signs of Whitaker's work, the hesitations, the sideways glances between buyers, the conferences that happened in undertones, the withdrawal of confidence from men who had looked at this horse 20 minutes ago and wanted her, and now weren't sure why they'd been so certain. Then Wesley Carter's voice came from the back. His first bid hit, like a stone dropped into still water. The number itself substantial, but the effect of it larger than the number, because the name attached to it carried weight that recalibrated everything in the room. Carter was bidding. Carter, who knew horses the way other men knew scripture. Carter, whose judgment in this arena was one of the few things in Red Valley that most people agreed was reliable. If Carter was bidding, there was something real here. The hesitation broke. Other bids came in competitive and quick, the energy of buyers who had been waiting for a signal and had finally gotten one. Whitaker bid twice, his face arranged in pleasant neutrality, and Carter met both bids without changing expression, without any performance of effort, just the steady, incremental movement of a man who had decided what he was willing to pay and wasn't interested in theater. 7 minutes. The hammer came down. The number was more than double her asking price. Something close to what the horse was actually worth. She walked out of the ring with her face composed and her hands at her sides, and she did not allow herself to feel anything until she was out of the main crowd sight line, and then she stopped walking and stood very still for a moment and let the wave move through her grief and relief and fury at Whitaker, and something that might distantly have been the first thin edge of gratitude. And then she pushed all of it back down, because there was still business to do, and she would not conduct it with tears on her face. Wesley Carter fell into step beside her before she'd covered 20 yards. "Congratulations," she said. "I'll get you the documentation. Bloodline records, training history, medical records going back to her birth. Everything's in order." "I expect it is," he said. He wasn't reaching for the reins. He was walking beside her with the unhurried quality of a man who had something to say and was going to say it in his own time. "Can I ask you something?" She waited. "What are you planning to do now?" It landed harder than she'd expected, because the honest answer was that she didn't know the debt would be cleared. There would be something left over and past, that there was a space where a future was supposed to be that she hadn't been able to see clearly for months. "I'll find something," she said. "I have a breeding program," he said. "Carter Ranch. Started it 3 years ago with good stock, but I've had 3 managers in 2 years, and none of them have what the program actually needs." He paused. "The Marlowe horses are the reason my 2 best working animals are what they are. Your father understood breeding at a level that most people in this territory don't. From what I've seen today, and from what I've heard over the years, so do you." She stopped walking. "I'm not offering charity," he said, and the directness of it told her he'd read her expression and was going straight to the center of what she needed to hear. "I'm offering a job, one that needs doing by someone who actually knows what they're doing at a fair wage. Come out to the ranch, look at the operation, and tell me whether you think there's something worth building." She looked at him for a long moment. She examined it the way she examined every offer that had come her way in the past 8 months, looking for the catch, the condition, the fine print of someone's generosity that would reveal itself once she'd already accepted. She didn't find one. That didn't mean there wasn't one, but she didn't find it. "I have conditions," she said. Something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe, of someone who had decided not to be managed. "Tell me. I work as a professional. My decisions about the breeding program are based on what I know, not on what I'm told to think. If there's a disagreement, I expect to be heard, not handled, not managed heard." She held his gaze. "And Rosewood stays in the program. Whatever arrangement we structure, that's part of it from the beginning." A beat of quiet. "Those are reasonable conditions," he said. "I know they are." The quickest possible version of a smile crossed his face and was gone before it could settle into anything. He extended his hand. She shook it. Firm brief, the handshake of two people entering an agreement they both intended to keep. Around them. The auction continued its ordinary business, horses and money, and the slow commerce of a territory, working out what it was worth. Clayton Whitaker was somewhere in that crowd, patient and pleasant, and already thinking 3 moves ahead. The debt her father hadn't taken was still a mystery with no resolution. The ranch was still gone. But Adeline Marlowe was not standing alone anymore. She was standing at the beginning of something she couldn't fully see yet, which was, she was beginning to understand exactly the position from which every worth-having thing in her life had started. Her father's voice came to her clear and unhurried, as it always was when she needed it. A person who knows the value of something should never let someone else decide its price. She hadn't. Not today. And she wasn't going to start. The handshake lasted 3 seconds. Adeline released Wesley Carter's hand, turned away before he could say anything else, and walked back toward Rosewood with the particular gait of someone who had made a decision and was already processing what that decision was going to cost them. She'd agreed to go to Carter Ranch. She'd set her conditions. He'd accepted them. The whole negotiation had taken less time than most people spent deciding what to order at a lunch counter, and now the reality of it was settling over her the way cold water settled all at once, unavoidable, clarifying. She was going to work for a man she'd met 2 hours ago. She was going to live on a ranch that belonged to someone else. She was going to rebuild something from nothing on someone else's land with someone else's horses, because nothing that had belonged to her was left. She pressed her hand flat against Rosewood's neck and held it there. "All right," she said quietly to herself, as much as to the mare. "All right." Rosewood turned her head and regarded her with one large dark eye. Patient and steady. The way she had been patient and steady every single day of the past 8 months, while Adeline had been coming apart at the seams and trying not to show it. "We're going somewhere new," Adeline told her. "You've done it before, so have I." She didn't entirely believe that last part, but she said it anyway. Wesley was waiting for her at the edge of the auction yard, talking in low tones with a weathered man in a canvas work coat who nodded twice and moved off before Adeline reached them. Wesley watched her approach with the same quality of attention he'd had on her all morning, not intrusive, not performative, just present. "My foreman," he said by way of explanation. "Letting him know we'll have an extra horse on the return." "And an extra person," she said. "That too." He glanced at Rosewood. "There's a wagon going back to the ranch this afternoon. You're welcome to ride with the driver, or there's a horse I can spare if you'd rather ride." She'd rather ride. She would always rather ride. "The horse," she said. He nodded, and that was the end of it. No fuss, no elaboration, just a practical matter, resolved practically. She was beginning to understand that this was how he operated, and she wasn't sure yet whether she found it reassuring or unnerving. They were preparing to leave the yard when she heard Whitaker's voice. I wasn't talking to her. He was standing 20 feet away in conversation with 2 men she recognized, Dodd Hargrove, who ran a mid-sized cattle operation north of town, and a younger man she didn't know well, someone who'd come into the territory in the past year. Whitaker was talking easily, his posture relaxed, and if she hadn't known what she knew about him, she would have looked at that scene and seen nothing more than 3 men having an ordinary conversation at the end of an auction. But she did know what she knew. And what she knew was that Whitaker was watching her over Hargrove's shoulder as he talked, and when their eyes met for exactly 1 second before he looked away. What she saw in his face was not anger at losing the bidding war on Rosewood. It was not frustration. It was something colder and more considered than either of those things. It was the expression of a man resetting a plan. She turned away and kept walking. "He's going to come at you from a different angle," Wesley said beside her quietly enough that only she could hear. He'd seen it too. "I know," she said. "Do you know why he wanted the horse that badly?" She'd been asking herself that since the bidding ended. A good horse was a good horse, and Rosewood was exceptional, but exceptional horses came to market regularly in Arizona territory. Whitaker was a man with money and connections. He could have found another exceptional horse without constructing the elaborate softening operation he'd run this morning. The lengths he'd gone to suggested something beyond simple acquisition. "The bloodline records," she said slowly, working it out as she said it. My father kept meticulous documentation on every horse he bred. Generations of records, performance histories, temperament assessments, breeding decisions, and the reasoning behind them. That information alone is worth more than the horse. Wesley was quiet for a moment. And whoever has the horse has the records. The records I have with me today, yes, but there are more. At the ranch, at what used to be the ranch, she stopped walking. The ranch that the bank took. The ranch that's currently sitting in the possession of whoever holds the debt my father apparently incurred. She looked at Wesley. The debt that doesn't match anything I knew about my father's business. The thought completed itself in her mind, with the particular clarity of something that had been assembling itself piece by piece for months, and had finally in this moment snapped into a shape she could see whole. The ranch records, she said. The breeding program documentation. The bloodline histories going back 30 years, all of it is still there. Everything that wasn't removed before the foreclosure. Wesley looked at her steadily. And if someone were to acquire the foreclosed property, they'd own all of it. Her voice came out flat. Everything my father built. Every record, every history, every piece of knowledge he spent his life accumulating. All of it. They stood there for a moment with that between them. Has anyone acquired it? She asked. The property. Do you know? Last I heard, the bank still held it. Foreclosure proceedings take time. He paused. But banks aren't known for holding territory properties indefinitely. They're in the business of money, not land management. Which means they'll sell it. Which means they'll sell it, he confirmed. She made herself start walking again, because standing still with this knowledge in her chest was going to undo 8 months of careful composure, and she was not going to come apart in an auction yard in front of Clayton Whitaker's peripheral vision. Carter Ranch was 45 miles northeast of Red Valley, which was far enough from town to feel like a different world, and close enough to it to maintain the connections a successful operation needed. The ride out took most of the afternoon, and Adeline spent it on a steady gray gelding that Wesley's stableman had brought around, a well-mannered animal, responsive and calm, clearly the product of someone who knew what they were doing with horses. Rosewood traveled alongside on a lead line, and Adeline kept one eye on the mare the way she always did in unfamiliar territory, monitoring for stress signals, watching how she moved. Rosewood moved fine. Rosewood was always fine. It was one of the things Adeline loved most about her, that fundamental equanimity, that quality of encountering the new and unfamiliar and deciding on balance that it was probably manageable. She wished she shared it more readily. Wesley rode slightly ahead for the first hour, handling some communication with his foreman that required his attention, and Adeline used the time alone to think. The rhythm of the horse's movement under her was familiar enough to be calming, the kind of physical sensation that her body knew well enough to process, automatically freeing her mind to work through what she'd learned this afternoon. Whitaker wanted the Marlowe breeding records. I wanted them badly enough to construct an elaborate manipulation to reduce Rosewood's auction value. Which meant he'd either known about the record's value for some time, had been planning, not improvising, or someone had told him what to look for. A person who understood the horse business well enough to know that 30 years of Nathaniel Marlowe's meticulous documentation was worth more in the right hands than the animals themselves. And if Whitaker was the kind of man who built up struggling ranches, bought them low from people in difficulty, always with paperwork that appeared legitimate, then the question she should have been asking for 8 months wasn't simply why her father's estate had collapsed. The question was whether it had been allowed to collapse, whether someone had helped it along. She held that thought very carefully, the way you held something fragile, and looked at it from all sides. Her father had been healthy. Her father had been careful. Her father had kept books that she'd helped maintain, and that she knew with the certainty of someone who had run their fingers across the actual numbers reflected a business operating within its means. The debt that had appeared after his death was large, specific, and documented with her father's signature. A signature she didn't recognize. She hadn't known 8 months ago that that was something worth pursuing. She hadn't known what she was looking at. She'd been grieving and overwhelmed and operating in a system where every person with any authority had told her she was misunderstanding things, and she'd spent so much energy trying to prove she wasn't wrong that she hadn't stopped to ask the larger question. What if she wasn't wrong? What if there was nothing to misunderstand because the debt was never real? What did you call a debt that wasn't real, backed by documents that looked legitimate, applied to a dead man who couldn't contest them? She called it theft, and she called the man who'd benefited from it by the name he deserved. Wesley dropped back to ride beside her as the light started to change, and she told him what she'd been thinking. All of it straight through without softening or qualifying or managing her language to make herself sound less certain than she was. She told him about the signature she didn't recognize. She told him about the attorney in Flagstaff who hadn't looked carefully. She told him about Harrison Pruitt's kitchen and the coffee he hadn't touched, and the thing he'd said quietly, like a man speaking in a room with thin walls. Wesley listened without interrupting. That was not a small thing she'd learned in 8 months of trying to explain this situation, that most people began formulating their response approximately 30 seconds into her account, and the response was usually some variation of the same patient dismissal. Wesley listened until she finished, and then he was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, it was not to question what she'd said. "How much documentation did your father keep on the debt specifically?" he asked. "Letters, agreements, communication with the bank." "Some of it would be at the ranch," she said. "In his study. He kept records of everything, every letter he sent, every letter he received, every agreement he entered, everything." She paused. "Or he did, until someone decided what was in those records was inconvenient. Or until someone decided to acquire the records along with the property." She looked at him. "You think it was planned?" "I think Clayton Whitaker is a careful man," he said. "I think careful men don't improvise." The ranch appeared as the last of the afternoon light was going gold and horizontal, and Adeline's first understanding of Carter Ranch was not visual but structural. The sense of an operation that had been built by someone who thought about systems, about how the parts of a thing related to each other, about efficiency, not as an aesthetic, but as a value. She heard it before she saw it clearly, the specific sounds of an active working ranch at the end of a day. A man came out to take the horses, young and efficient, and Wesley introduced him as Danny without ceremony. Danny took Rosewood's lead with the careful hands of someone who'd been taught to read a horse before touching one, and Adeline noted that without showing that she'd noted it. "I'll show you the breeding operation in the morning," Wesley said, "when the light's right and you can actually see what you're looking at. Tonight?" He paused, the slight pause of a man navigating logistics. "The main house has a spare room off the east wing. Mrs. Hensley, she keeps the house, will have it ready." "That's fine," Adeline said. "It's not charity," he said with the same directness he'd used at the auction. "It comes out of your wage." She almost smiled. Almost. "I know." Mrs. Hensley was a compact woman in her 60s, with the brisk competence of someone who had been managing a large household for decades and had opinions about how things should be done that she was willing to share but not impose. She showed Adeline to the room, asked 2 practical questions about her preferences, and left her to it without hovering. It was, Adeline thought, the most comfortable welcome she'd received from anyone in 8 months. She didn't sleep well. She hadn't expected to. She lay in the dark and thought about her father's study. The particular smell of it, old paper and leather, and the cedar of the desk he'd bought the year before she was born, the way the late afternoon light had come through the west window and landed on the rows of ledgers and record books that lined the shelf behind his chair. 30 years of careful attention. 30 years of every horse that had come through the Marlowe operation documented and cross-referenced, and kept with the same quality of methodical love that her father had brought to every aspect of his work. She thought about those records in the hands of Clayton Whitaker, and felt sick in a way that had nothing to do with being tired. She was up before dawn. She found the kitchen by following the sound of the fire being built and the smell of coffee, and she found Wesley already there, sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup in front of him and a piece of paper covered in figures that he folded away when she came in without any self-consciousness about it. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was a fraction of the truth. He got up and poured her coffee without asking, set it in front of her, and sat back down. It was such a simple domestic gesture done so matter-of-factly that she nearly didn't notice it. She noticed it. "I want to ride out to the Marlowe property," she said. "The foreclosed ranch. I want to see what's still there." He looked at her over his cup. "That's not legal territory you want to wander into alone." "I'm not asking for permission," she said. "I'm telling you what I intend to do." A beat of silence. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you, I'll come with you." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" "Because," he said with the simplicity of someone who had thought about something and arrived at a conclusion and was not interested in dressing it up. "What you're describing matters. If Whitaker is doing what I think he's doing, he's not just robbing one woman of her father's ranch. He's been doing it to people across this territory for years, and he's going to keep doing it until someone stops him." He paused. "And because your father was a good man who did honest work and deserved better than what happened to him." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and didn't say anything for a moment. "The bank holds the property," she said finally. "We can't just ride onto it." "No," he agreed. "But I know the man who holds the paper on it. Gerald Marsh at the Territorial Bank in Flagstaff. I've done business with him for 15 years. He picked up his cup. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who does what his institution requires. If there's a question about the legitimacy of the debt that created the foreclosure, he'd want to know about it, not out of generosity, but because a fraudulent foreclosure creates legal exposure for the bank." Adeline set her cup down. "You've been thinking about this since yesterday." "Since the auction," he said simply. She studied him across the kitchen table in the early morning light. This man she'd known for less than a full day, who had bought her horse and hired her, and was now telling her he intended to help her investigate the crime she'd been trying to prove for 8 months, and everyone had told her wasn't a crime at all. "What do you get out of this?" she asked, because she needed to ask it, because she'd learned the hard way that offers without visible benefit were the most dangerous kind. He looked at her steadily. "Honest answer. That's the only kind I'm interested in. Whitaker has been moving on operations near my ranch for the past 18 months, he said. 2 of my neighbors have had financial troubles that appeared suddenly and resolved in his favor. I've been watching it happen and not been able to do a damn thing about it because I didn't have anything concrete. If your father's records show what I think they might show, a pattern documentation, something that goes beyond one case that changes things." He paused. "Beyond that, it's the right thing to do. That's not nothing to me." She believed him. She wasn't certain that was wise. She'd trusted things that turned out to be wrong before, but she believed him, and she decided to act on that belief because she didn't have the luxury of waiting for certainty. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The records at the ranch, the breeding program documentation, my father had a system. He coded certain records, nothing elaborate. Not a formal cipher, just a personal notation system that he developed over the years to flag transactions or breeding decisions that he wanted to revisit." She paused. "I know the system. I helped him develop it." Wesley set his cup down very carefully. "And if Whitaker gets those records, he gets the data, but not the full context," she said. "He gets the what without the why. And in breeding records, the why is everything. You can know what a horse did. Without knowing the reasoning behind the breeding decision, you don't know what it means. So the records, without your knowledge of how to read them, are less valuable than he thinks they are," she said. "But I'd still rather he didn't have them." Wesley was quiet for a long moment. Outside the kitchen window, the ranch was waking up. She could hear it, the sounds of early morning work beginning, animals and men, and the ordinary machinery of a working operation. Inside the kitchen was warm and smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something baking that she hadn't asked about. "We ride to Flagstaff the day after tomorrow," he said. "Give me today to sort what needs sorting here. You spend today looking at the breeding operation. Tell me what you see." He met her eyes. "And then we start figuring out what actually happened to your father." She nodded once. She'd been fighting alone for 8 months. She'd gotten very good at it, and she'd gotten very tired of it, and she was not going to let the relief of having an ally make her careless or naive or soft in the ways she couldn't afford to be soft. She was going to stay clear-eyed and practical, and she was going to hold on to her conditions the way she held on to everything that mattered, with both hands, with her weight behind it, and without apology. But she was not alone anymore, and in a territory that had spent 8 months arranging itself against her, that was not a small thing. The breeding operation at Carter Ranch was good. She recognized that within the first 20 minutes of walking through it. The next morning, Wesley beside her, his foreman Danny, trailing at a respectful distance. Good stock, well-maintained, careful records, the work of someone who understood the basics and had invested real money in getting them right. It was also missing something. She could feel the gap before she could name it, the way you felt a missing note in a piece of music before you could identify which note it was. "Tell me," Wesley said. He'd been watching her face. "Your breeding pairs are selected for confirmation," she said. "Good confirmation, correct confirmation. But your temperament data is thin. You're tracking physical traits and performance numbers, but you're not tracking disposition inheritance systematically." She moved to the next stall, looked at the mare inside. "This one. When did she last have difficulty with a new handler?" Wesley looked at Danny. "3 weeks ago," Danny said after a moment. "Through Callum when he took her out for the first time." "Is that in the record?" Danny and Wesley exchanged a look. "Not specifically," Danny said. "It needs to be," Adeline said. "Not because she's a problem horse, she may not be, but because if that disposition is heritable and you breed her without tracking it, you're going to get that trait in 3 or 4 animals, 2 generations down, and you won't know where it came from." She turned to Wesley. "My father tracked temperament through 5 generations. It's one of the reasons Marlowe horses worked so well. You knew not just what you were getting physically, but how the animal was going to behave under pressure." Wesley looked at her for a moment. "How long would it take to build that kind of documentation?" "Depends on how far back your records go and how accurately they were kept." 3 years. "Then we build forward from here, and we note gaps honestly rather than pretending they don't exist." She looked at the mare again. "It'll take 2 breeding cycles before you start seeing the data clearly. Longer before it shapes your decisions in ways you can feel. But it'll be worth it. It's the difference between a good operation and a great one," she said simply. She spent the rest of that day in the breeding records, cross-referencing what existed, making notes, building in her mind the architecture of what the program needed to become. She worked the way she always worked, fully, without awareness of time passing, with the focused absorption that her father had called her greatest professional quality, and her occasional housekeeper in better days had called her greatest personal exasperating flaw. She was still working when Mrs. Hensley appeared at the door of the records room to tell her supper was ready, and she looked up to find that the light had gone entirely, and she'd been working by lamplight for 2 hours without noticing. She washed her hands and came to the table to find Wesley already there, and 2 other men she'd seen around the ranch but hadn't been introduced to, the foreman Danny and an older man named Calhoun, who handled the property's financial administration. They made room for her at the table without ceremony. And the conversation that happened over supper was the ordinary conversation of a working ranch. What needed doing, what had been done, what the weather was likely to do in the next week. Nobody asked her about her father. Nobody asked about the auction. Nobody looked at her with the particular quality of attention that meant they were reassessing something about what she was. She ate her supper and listened and contributed when she had something to say. And it was not until she was walking back down the hall to the East Wing room that she recognized what she'd been feeling at that table. Normal. She'd felt normal. Like a person in the ordinary world doing ordinary work, sitting down to an ordinary meal. She hadn't felt that in 8 months. She was almost to her door when she heard quick boot steps on the porch and the front door opening with more speed than the day's pace had suggested, and then Danny's voice saying something in a low, urgent tone that didn't carry through the hall walls. She stopped. Wesley's voice answered sharper than she'd heard it yet. She went back toward the front of the house. She didn't announce herself. She came to the edge of the main hall where she could see the entryway, and what she saw was Danny holding a folded piece of paper and Wesley reading it with his jaw set in the way of a man processing information he'd been expecting and hoping he was wrong about. "When did this come?" Wesley asked. "Ryder brought it about an hour ago," Danny said. "Said it was urgent." Wesley looked up and saw her standing there. He didn't look surprised. He held the paper out. She crossed the hall and took it. It was a notice from the Territorial Bank in Flagstaff. Formal language, the kind of language that financial institutions used when they wanted to sound neutral while conveying something that was anything but. The foreclosed Marlowe property 40 miles north of Red Valley, 160 acres ranch structures and outbuildings had been sold. The sale had been completed 2 days ago. She read the buyer's name twice. A land-holding company registered in Tucson, a name she didn't recognize. But below the company name in smaller print, the name of the registered agent who had completed the transaction. R. Whitaker, acting on behalf of CW Land Holdings. She stood there with the paper in her hands and felt the rage move through her clean and cold, from her chest to her fingertips. He'd moved before the auction. He'd been moving before she'd even arrived in Red Valley yesterday morning. While she was standing in that yard trying to hold herself together, while she was refusing his low offer for Rosewood, while Wesley was running up the bidding, and she was shaking the hand of a man who'd offered her a job while all of that was happening, Whitaker had already bought her father's ranch. He already had the records. He moved fast, Wesley said. Not surprised. Measuring something. He knew we'd come looking, she said. Her voice was steady. She made it steady the way she made everything steady through the particular act of will that had gotten her through 8 months of a world arranged against her. He knew if I found out what was in those records, I'd go to the bank. He closed the deal before we could get to Flagstaff. Yes, Wesley said. So the records are his now. He has physical possession of them, Wesley said carefully. That's not the same thing as owning what they prove. She looked at him. Records can be copied, he said. Your father sent correspondence. Buyers received documentation when they purchased horses. Anyone who bought a Marlowe horse has paperwork that originated in that breeding program that carries your father's notations that exists independently of whatever Whitaker now holds in that study. He paused. And you know the notation system. You know what the records mean in a way he can't because you helped build it. She turned the paper over in her hands. He thinks he's won, she said. He thinks he's contained the situation, Wesley said. That's not the same thing as winning. She looked at the paper one more time. The company name, the registered agent's name, the date of sale 2 days ago. Everything arranged cleanly, professionally, with the particular quality of a maneuver executed by someone who had been planning it for long enough to be confident in the details. Clayton Whitaker had her father's records. He had the land. He had 30 years of accumulated knowledge about the finest horse breeding program in Arizona Territory. What he didn't have was her. And what she was beginning to understand standing in the hallway of Carter Ranch with Wesley. Beside her, and a lamp throwing yellow light across the paper in her hands, was that was not a small thing. Her father had not just given her his records. He'd given her the knowledge to read them. The training to understand them. The 15 years of practical experience that turned data into wisdom in a way that no document could capture. Whitaker had taken everything her father had written down. But the thing that made those records alive, the thing that made them more than ink and paper, he couldn't take. Because it was standing in this hallway. Because it was her. She folded the bank notice in half, set it on the hall table, and walked back to her room. She didn't slam the door. She didn't throw anything. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed slowly and deliberately, the way her father had taught her to breathe when something knocked the air out of her, in through the nose count 4, out through the mouth count 4, until the world stopped tilting. It took longer than usual tonight. Whitaker had the ranch. He had the records. He had 30 years of her father's work sitting in that study, and he'd acquired it 2 days ago, which meant he'd been moving on it before the auction, before Rosewood, before any of yesterday's maneuvering, which meant the auction itself had been secondary. A cleanup operation. He'd already taken the main thing. He was just trying to close off the loose ends. She was the loose end. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up, lit the lamp, pulled out the small journal she'd been keeping since February. Not a diary. Nothing personal. Just a running record of facts, dates, names, figures. The things she'd been collecting and couldn't afford to lose, and she opened it to a fresh page and started writing. She wrote everything she knew, everything she suspected, every date she could remember, every name, every conversation, every document she'd seen, and every document she'd been told existed that she'd never been allowed to examine. She wrote Harrison Pruitt's name and what he'd said in his kitchen. She wrote the attorney's name in Flagstaff and the specific language he'd used. She wrote the names of the ranch hands who'd left, and when they'd left, and whether any of them might remember things worth remembering. She wrote until the lamp needed trimming, and then she trimmed it and kept writing. By the time she stopped, she had 6 pages, and the first pale suggestion of light was beginning at the edge of the window, and she understood something she hadn't fully understood before. She'd been fighting this thing defensively for 8 months, responding to each new blow as it landed, trying to hold ground rather than take it. That was finished now. Whitaker had moved on the ranch and taken away the last piece she'd been hoping to recover, and that meant there was nothing left to defend. There was only what came next. What came next was attack. She was at the kitchen table when Wesley came down at 5, and from the look on his face when he saw the lamp already lit and her journal open beside her coffee cup, he'd expected to find her there. He sat down across from her without a word and poured his own coffee and waited. "I need to know everything you know about Whitaker," she said. "Not impressions, facts, dates, names, transactions, anything you can document or that someone else can document." "All right. And I need to know who else he's done this to. The ranches you mentioned, the 2 neighbors. I need to talk to them." "Bauer sold out 8 months ago and moved his family to New Mexico," Wesley said. "I've got an address. Hendricks is still in the territory up near Prescott. He lost his operation, but he's working a smaller place managing it for someone else." He looked at her steadily. "You think they'll talk?" "I think people talk when they believe someone's actually listening," she said. "I've spent 8 months trying to be heard by people who'd already decided what they were going to hear. I know what that feels like from the inside. I'm going to go to those men, and I'm going to listen first and talk second and see what comes of it." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "That's a 2-week ride minimum. Prescott and back with a detour for a letter to Bauer." "I know." The breeding program will keep for 2 weeks," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her carefully, measuring the distance between a request and a declaration. "I've written up the immediate priorities. Danny's competent. He can manage the daily work with what I've given him." She held his gaze. "I need to do this, Wesley." He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to argue. He didn't. "We leave in 2 days, he said. "I've got a contract negotiation I can't defer. After that, I'm free." "I didn't ask you to come." "No," he agreed. "I'm telling you I'm going anyway. You can object if you want to." She looked at him across the kitchen table. This man who kept making decisions in her direction with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had evaluated a situation and concluded that involvement was correct, without making a production of it, without requiring her gratitude or her permission. She didn't object. 2 days, she said. The day and a half before they left was not idle. Adeline spent it in the breeding records, not because the investigation could wait, but because the work was real and the horses needed what they needed, regardless of what Clayton Whitaker had or hadn't done, and she had made a commitment that she intended to keep. She documented the temperament gaps. She reorganized the filing system so that the information her father would have called essential was findable without knowing where to look. She spent 3 hours with a young stallion that Danny had flagged as difficult, not riding him, just working him in the yard, reading him, getting a sense of what the difficulty actually was. It wasn't what Danny had thought. The horse wasn't difficult. He was undertrained in a specific and correctable way, oversensitive on the left rein, because someone had leaned on it too consistently in his early work, creating a defensive pattern that looked like resistance but was actually anticipation. She worked him for an hour and handed him back to Danny with instructions so specific that Danny wrote them down, which she appreciated. On the evening before they left, a rider came in from town with a letter. It was addressed to her. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar. Careful, the writing of someone who did not write frequently and was being deliberate about it. She opened it at the kitchen table with Wesley across from her and read it twice before she said anything. "Tom Briggs," she said. "My father's foreman, the one who left in March." Wesley looked up. "He says he needs to talk to me." She set the letter flat on the table. "He says he saw something before he left. Something about the documents, the loan documents, that he didn't understand at the time and didn't know what to do with and has been thinking about ever since." She looked at Wesley. "He's in Red Valley. He's been in Red Valley for 2 months. He came back because he couldn't stop thinking about it. Wesley was very still. Does he say what he saw? He says he doesn't want to put it in a letter. Her voice was careful, controlled the voice she used when something mattered enough that she couldn't afford to let the emotion run ahead of the thinking. He says he'll meet me anywhere I name, anytime I name, and he'll tell me everything. The silence in the kitchen was the particular silence of two people processing the same information at the same speed and arriving at the same place. He came back, Wesley said. He came back, she said. Tom Briggs had worked for her father for 12 years. He'd stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and told her he was sorry he had a family he couldn't stay. He'd left in March and apparently lived with whatever he'd seen for 5 months until it had brought him back to a town he'd left specifically to get away from the trouble because he couldn't carry it anymore. Whatever he'd seen, it was real. You didn't do that for something that wasn't real. They sent a reply that evening and rode into Red Valley the following morning before the plan had been to leave. Tom Briggs was waiting for them at the livery stable, which was where she'd said to meet neutral ground. Private enough, the kind of place where a conversation could happen without an audience. Howe was thinner than she remembered. He'd aged in the way men aged when they'd been carrying something heavy. The particular wearing down that happened not from physical work, but from the weight of an unresolved thing. He had his hat in his hands. When she walked in the same gesture she remembered from March, and his face when he looked at her had an expression she recognized as guilt, doing its best to hold itself together. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "Tom." She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him the way she looked at a horse she was trying to read directly without aggression, making space for whatever was there. "I'm glad you wrote." "I should have written in March," he said. "I should have. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't know for certain what it meant, but I couldn't stop seeing it." "Tell me what you saw." He took a breath. 2 weeks before your father died. He said, "A man came to the ranch. I didn't know him. He came in the evening, which was unusual. We didn't get much business after dark. Your father saw him in the study. I was doing the late rounds checking the horses, and I came back past the house and the study light was on. I could hear voices, not what they were saying, just that there were two of them, and that the tone was—" He paused, searching for the word "not comfortable," not a friendly visit. Adeline kept her breathing steady, kept her face still. "Go on." "The man left about an hour later. I saw him go. He had a good horse, well kept, and he moved like a man in a hurry. Like someone who'd gotten what he came for and wanted to be gone." Tom's hands tightened on his hat. "After he left, I went back past the study window because your father's light was still on, and it was late, and I don't know exactly. Worried, maybe. He hadn't seemed himself the past few weeks." "What did you see?" "Your father was sitting at his desk," Tom said. "He was sitting there and he wasn't doing anything. Not reading, not writing, not looking at the books. Just sitting. And his face—" Tom stopped, swallowed. "I've known Nathaniel Marlowe for 12 years. I've seen him in hard weather, bad seasons, disputes with buyers, the time he lost 4 horses to fever and thought he might lose the whole bloodline. I've seen him handle hard things." "Tom." "He looked scared," Tom said. "He looked like a man who'd just been told something that scared him and he didn't know what to do about it." The kitchen of the livery office was very quiet. "Did you see the man's face?" Wesley asked from behind her. Quiet, not intrusive. "Not clearly. It was dark and I was at the window. But he was well dressed. Not a ranchman. Someone who worked indoors." Tom paused. "And he was carrying a leather case. The kind lawyers carry." Adeline looked at Wesley. Wesley looked back at her and said nothing, and she understood what neither of them was saying, that a well-dressed man with a lawyer's case who visited a ranch after dark and left a careful man looking scared was exactly the kind of detail that in a different world would have been investigated immediately. In this world, in 1883, in a territory where a young woman's account of her dead father's business was treated as grief-confused misunderstanding, it was a detail that had sat unseen for 8 months while the men who might have done something about it looked the other way. "Did you tell anyone?" she asked. Tom looked at his hat. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself your father was a grown man who handled his own affairs and didn't need his foreman speculating. A pause heavy with every... I told myself a lot of things. Tom. She waited until he looked at her. Did you tell anyone? He met her eyes, and she saw in his face the specific quality of a man who had been answering this question to himself for 5 months. No, he said. I didn't. And then your father died 2 weeks later, and everything happened so fast, and by the time I understood what I was looking at, it felt too late to say anything, and I had my family to think about, and... He stopped himself. Those are reasons. They're not good enough reasons, and I know it. She didn't reassure him. He was right, and they both knew it, and false comfort wasn't something either of them needed right now. The man with the case, she said. Think carefully. Was there anything else? Anything at all, the way he talked, the direction he came from, anything on the horse? Tom was quiet for a long moment. The horse had a brand I didn't recognize. Not a local brand, something from further south. Tucson, maybe. And... He stopped. What? He left something behind, Tom said slowly, like a man pulling something up from a depth he hadn't visited in a while. Or he dropped something. I found it the next morning near the gate where he'd tied his horse. I picked it up and I kept it because I didn't know what to do with it, and I was afraid to throw it away. Adeline stared at him. What was it? Tom reached into his coat pocket and produced a small card. Printed on good stock, the kind of a professional man carried. He held it out to her. She took it. The name on the card was not Clayton Whitaker's name. It was a name she didn't recognize, a legal firm in Tucson, a man named Harlan Voss. But in the corner of the card, in small handwritten ink that had faded but was still legible, someone had written 2 letters and a number. CW7. She held the card very still and looked at it and thought about what CW meant when it appeared on a land holding company in Tucson, registered in connection with Clayton Whitaker, and what the number 7 might mean when the man who used those initials had been systematically acquiring distressed properties throughout Arizona territory. She thought about 6 ranches in 3 years. If hers was 7, then whoever kept this count had been keeping it since before Nathaniel Marlowe died. Which meant the visit 2 weeks before his death wasn't a consequence of his financial trouble. It was the beginning of it. Wesley, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. I see it, he said. He was looking at the card over her shoulder. She turned to Tom. I need you to write down everything you just told me, exactly as you told it, with the dates as best you can remember them. And I need you to be willing to say it again in front of someone who can make it matter. Tom looked at her, and she could see the fear in him. The practical, reasonable fear of a man with a family and a livelihood who was being asked to put himself in the path of someone powerful and patient and capable of serious harm. I know what I'm asking, she said. I know it's not nothing. If it was nothing, Tom said quietly, I wouldn't have come back. He wrote the statement that afternoon sitting at the livery office table with a pen she'd borrowed from the stable manager, writing slowly and carefully in the handwriting of a man who read more than he wrote. Adeline sat across from him and did not rush him and did not add to what he was writing. When he was done, she read it, asked him 2 clarifying questions, and folded it carefully into her journal beside the bank notice she'd been carrying. Then she did something Tom hadn't expected. She thanked him. Not the quick functional thank you of someone moving on to the next thing. She looked at him directly, and she said, My father trusted you for 12 years. He was right to. What you did today coming back writing this, he'd have been glad to know you did it. Tom Briggs pressed his mouth together and looked at his hat for a moment. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. You're the image of him, he said. The way he listened. The way he didn't waste words. Always knew you took after him more than you knew. She held that on the inside where it couldn't be seen, and she nodded once, and she and Wesley walked out into the midday heat of Red Valley. They stood in the street outside the livery, and the town moved around them, the way towns moved, carts, horses, voices, the ordinary machinery of a place that didn't know it was being watched. Voss, Wesley said. Harlan Voss. I know that name. She looked at him. He's a contract lawyer. Works mostly in Tucson, occasionally in Flagstaff. He's done work for the Territorial Bank before, not regularly, but occasionally on complicated acquisition cases. He paused. And I have seen his name on a deed transfer, about 2 years ago, a property outside of Benson. Whitaker's. The company's. The same company that just bought your father's ranch. He looked at her. He's not just Whitaker's lawyer. He's the man who builds the paper trail, the documentation, the signatures. The signatures. The signature on her father's loan documents that she didn't recognize. She said it out loud quietly, standing in the middle of a red valley street with the sun directly overhead. He forged the documents. Voss built the legal structure. Whitaker acquired the properties. They've been doing this together. 3 years, Wesley said. Minimum, probably longer. 7 properties, she said. That we know of. That we know of, he agreed. She thought about the other families. The other people who'd stood where she'd been standing for the past 8 months, fighting something they couldn't quite see, being told they were wrong, being slowly exhausted into compliance. She thought about Bauer, who'd moved his family to New Mexico. She thought about Hendricks working someone else's land, now up near Prescott. She thought about all the people who hadn't had a Tom Briggs come back. We need Voss, she said. Not just Whitaker. Whitaker is the face of it, but Voss built the mechanism. Without the mechanism, you don't have the case. You have a story. Getting to Voss means going through Tucson. I know. Tucson is Whitaker's territory. He has connections there. He has people who'll tell him the moment we start asking questions. Then we don't start there, she said. We start with Hendricks. We go to Prescott. We hear his story. We see what documentation he has. Then we go to Flagstaff, and we talk to Marsh at the bank, because if Voss has been using the bank's authority to legitimize fraudulent documents, the bank is either complicit or they've been victimized too, and either way, they need to know what they're sitting on. She looked at Wesley. And then we go to Tucson. Wesley was quiet for a moment. That's a month of writing. Yes. The breeding program. We'll be fine. She said it the way she'd been saying true things for the past 2 days plainly, without softening, with the specific quality of someone who had calculated the cost and decided it was the right thing to spend. Danny has my notes. The critical pairs won't cycle for another 6 weeks. There's nothing I can do there in the next month that can't be done when I get back. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she felt the weight of it, the specific quality of someone who was making a decision about something and was going to make it carefully. There's something I should tell you, he said. She waited. When I bought the horses from your father 4 years ago, we had a conversation, your father and I. He showed me the breeding records personally, walked me through the notation system, spent about 2 hours explaining not just what I was buying but why. He paused. He talked about you. She kept her face still. He said, and I'm giving you the words as close as I can recall them. He said, the system is only half of it. Adeline understands the half that isn't written down. That's the part that matters. He looked at her. He wasn't talking about horses. The wave moved through her, the way waves moved fast, total through her chest and her throat, and behind her eyes, and she stood in the street in the Arizona midday and let it move without letting it break. She had learned to do this. She had needed to learn. He should have told me that, she said, and her voice was steady. Probably, Wesley said. He seemed like a man who found some things easier to say to near strangers than to the people he loved most. She breathed out slowly. That's accurate. Most people are that way. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you tell him about the horses at the end of the conversation? I told him they were the finest animals I'd looked at in 20 years, Wesley said, and that whatever he'd built it deserved to outlast him. She pressed her lips together and looked at the middle distance for 3 seconds. We leave in the morning, she said. Can you be ready? I've been ready since yesterday, he said. They were halfway back to the ranch when the second rider caught up to them, a young man on a blowing horse coming hard from the direction of Red Valley, and the urgency in the animal's pace was enough to make Wesley pull up and wait before the rider had called out to them. He pulled alongside, breathing almost as hard as the horse. He was a boy, really 16 or 17, and his face had the specific expression of someone carrying information that was heavier than he'd expected. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "Yes. Message from Mr. Dodd Hargrove. He said to find you before you left town." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "He said to tell you it was urgent. He said he made me memorize it, ma'am. He said tell her, Whitaker knows she has the card. Tell her he's already moving." The world didn't stop. It never stopped. That was the thing. The sun stayed where it was, the horses kept standing. The boy kept looking at her with his young face full of the importance of his errand. Everything stayed exactly where it was. She took the paper. She read it. It was brief. Hargrove's handwriting quick and slightly uneven, the writing of a man who'd written fast. "Whitaker knows Tom Briggs contacted you. I don't know how he has ears everywhere. He's filing a complaint with the Territorial Land Office, claiming you've been in possession of property documentation that belongs to CW Land Holdings since the sale. He's framing it as theft. Move fast." She folded the paper and looked at Wesley. Wesley looked back at her with the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this and was adjusting his timeline. "How fast can you be ready?" she said. 2 hours, he said. 1 if Danny packs my kit." 1 hour, she said. She was already turning the horse. Whitaker had found out about Tom Briggs in less than 4 hours, which meant he had someone in Red Valley, not just connections, someone specific and placed and watching. Which meant every move she made in that town was visible to him within the time it took a man to ride between properties. Which meant she could not afford to be predictable. She rode back to Carter Ranch with the card from Tom Briggs in her pocket, and Hargrove's note folded against it, and 6 pages of her own documentation in the journal against her hip. And she thought about a man who had been planning this for at minimum 3 years, who had lawyers and land companies and informants and patients, who had taken her father's ranch and 7 others, and was now trying to reframe the only evidence against him as theft by the person he'd stolen from. She thought about how much he'd underestimated her for 8 months. She thought about how that was the only advantage she had, and how she intended to use every last inch of it. Mrs. Hensley was in the kitchen when she came in, and she looked at Adeline's face and said without preamble, "I'll pack food for 3 days." "2 riders," Adeline said. 3 days. "I know how to pack for 2 riders," Mrs. Hensley said, and turned back to the larder, and that was the end of it. Adeline went to the records room and spent 45 minutes transferring the most critical information from her journal into a second copy, which she sealed in an envelope and addressed to Harrison Pruitt in Red Valley, with a note that said simply, "Keep this. Tell no one. If I don't contact you in 30 days, take it to the Federal Land Office in Prescott." She left it with Mrs. Hensley to post. Then she went to say goodbye to Rosewood. The mare was in the paddock, and she came to the fence when Adeline appeared the way she always had and pressed her nose against Adeline's shoulder, warm and familiar, and completely uncomplicated in the way that only animals manage to be. "I'll be back," Adeline told her. She meant it as information. She needed it to be true. Rosewood breathed against her neck slow and steady. Wesley appeared at the paddock fence. He had his travel kit over one shoulder and 2 horses ready behind him, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the auction, direct and calm, without the quality of assessment that most men brought to women in difficult situations, the quality that was evaluating rather than simply seeing. "Ready," he said. She scratched Rosewood once behind the ear, stepped back from the fence and turned. "I've been ready for 8 months," she said. And they rode out before the hour was up into the long afternoon light of Arizona Territory, heading northeast toward Prescott, and a man named Hendricks, who might or might not remember something that could matter, carrying between them a handful of paper and a story that wasn't finished yet. Behind them somewhere in Red Valley, Clayton Whitaker was making his next move. Ahead of them, the territory stretched out long and complicated and full of the kind of truth that didn't announce itself, but waited to be found by people patient and stubborn enough to keep looking. Adeline Marlowe had been both things her whole life. She wasn't planning to stop now. They rode hard the first day and didn't talk much. That suited Adeline fine. She had too much moving through her head to make conversation, and Wesley seemed to understand that without needing it, explained he kept pace beside her. handled his horse with the easy competence of a man who'd spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it, and left her to her thinking the way a person left someone to their grief with presence and without intrusion. She was thinking about Whitaker's informant. Someone in Red Valley had known about Tom Briggs within hours of their meeting, not days' hours. That kind of speed meant either someone had been watching the livery specifically, or someone had been watching her from the moment she arrived in town, and the informant was close enough to whatever Whitaker's operation looked like from the inside that the information moved fast and clean and without delay. She ran through the morning in her mind. Who had seen her arrive? Who had seen her go to the livery? Who had been in a position to know that Tom Briggs had come back to Red Valley, and why? The stable manager, a man named Pruitt's nephew, whose name she couldn't remember. The boy who'd taken their horses when they first arrived at the auction. 2 women at the edge of the yard who'd watched everything with the attentiveness of people who made it their business to watch. Dodd Hargrove himself, who'd sent the warning, though she trusted the warning, or she wouldn't be riding now. Or someone she hadn't seen at all. Someone who was simply there in the ordinary fabric of the town, invisible, because they looked like everyone else. She couldn't know. That was the thing that made it sit so unpleasantly in her chest. She couldn't know, which meant she had to operate as though every person she'd spoken to in Red Valley was potentially compromised, which was a paranoid way to live, and also, given the evidence, a reasonable one. She was still working through it when Wesley said, "Penny," without looking at her. "I'm counting informants," she said. "Come up with a number." "No, which is the problem?" I was quiet for a moment. Whitaker's been building this for 3 years, maybe longer. A man who builds something that carefully builds his information network the same way slowly over time from people who owe him favors, or fear him, or both. He paused. The question isn't who told him today. The question is, how many people in this territory he has that kind of access to. That's a worse problem than the one I was already thinking about. Yes, he agreed. It is. They made camp that first night in a dry wash 15 miles outside of Red Valley, and Adeline sat by the fire with her journal and worked through the timeline again, while Wesley dealt with the horses. She'd been building this timeline for months, but it looked different now with Tom Briggs's statement added to it, and the card with Voss's name, and the CW7 notation sitting in her pocket like a stone she kept needing to hold to make sure it was still real. Her father had received a late-night visit 2 weeks before he died. The visitor had carried a lawyer's case and left behind a card connecting him to Whitaker. Her father had died of a sudden heart episode with no prior warning. 2 months later, documentation appeared claiming he'd taken a substantial loan against the property. The foreclosure had proceeded with a speed she now recognized as suspicious. Faster than standard proceedings required, driven by people who already knew what they were doing and had done it before. 6 times before. Minimum. She wrote that down in the margin of her notes, underlined it, and sat looking at it. What did Whitaker want with my father's operation specifically? She said to the fire, and to Wesley equally, not requiring an answer, but needing to say it out loud. He's been taking ranches. The Bauer operation was cattle. Hendricks was mixed. Why a horse breeding program? It's slower to profit than cattle or land speculation. Because it's worth more long-term, Wesley said from behind her. He came around the fire and sat on his side of it, hands around his coffee cup. Cattle you sell once, land you hold or develop. But a breeding program with 30 years of documentation, that's a competitive advantage that compounds. The buyers who'd pay for access to Marlowe bloodline records aren't local ranchers. They're operations in California, in Texas, and Mexico. People building programs of their own who want a head start. He looked at her across the fire. Your father's records are worth 10 times what the ranch is worth to the right buyer. She sat with that. He's not keeping it, she said slowly. He's going to sell it. All of it. The land, the records, the breeding program, documentation as a package. To someone outside the territory who won't know or care how he acquired it. Which means we have less time than I thought, Wesley said. How long to find a buyer for something like that? Depends on how prepared he is. If he's been anticipating this acquisition, if he planned it the way he planned the others, he may already have a buyer in conversation. He set his cup down. A month, maybe less. A month. She closed her journal and looked at the fire. Then we ride faster, she said. They reached the outskirts of Prescott on the third day in the late afternoon, and Adeline's first act was to send a message ahead to a name Wesley had given her. A woman who ran a boarding house and could be trusted, which was the operative criteria for everything right now. Her second act was to find out where Frank Hendricks was working. I was managing a small horse operation 6 miles outside of town, and he came to meet them at the boarding house that evening with the specific wariness of a man who had learned the hard way what happened when he trusted people who turned out not to deserve it. I was in his late 40s, compact and weathered with the calloused hands of a man who'd been working horses his whole life and the guarded eyes of someone who'd had something taken. He looked at Adeline the way people sometimes looked at other people who'd been through the same kind of thing, with recognition and with the complicated feeling of not being glad about the recognition. "You're Nathaniel's daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she said. "And I think what happened to your ranch is the same thing that happened to my father's." He sat down across from her. He talked for 2 hours. The shape of it was exactly what she'd expected, and somehow still worse to hear out loud. A sudden creditor's claim. Documents he didn't recognize bearing his signature. A bank proceeding that moved faster than he'd been told was legally possible. A lawyer in Tucson, Harlan Voss, who'd appeared on behalf of the creditor and been unfailingly polite and completely immovable. A land company that had acquired the operation for 60 cents on the dollar. "I hired my own lawyer," Hendricks said. "Man in Prescott, been practicing here 20 years. He looked at the documents and said they were legitimate. I told him my signature was wrong. I don't sign my name that way. I never have. My runs different. He told me signatures vary." A pause, and the pause had a bitterness in it that 8 months of her own life made completely familiar to her. "I told him I knew my own handwriting. He told me grief and stress could affect memory." Adeline's jaw tightened. She kept her face still. "Did you keep anything?" she asked. "Any documentation from before contracts correspondence? Anything from the original operation?" Hendricks looked at her. Then he looked at Wesley. Then he got up without saying anything and went to the back room and came back with a wooden box that had the look of something that had been carried carefully for a long time. He set it on the table between them. "Everything I could take before they changed the locks," he said. She opened the box. Inside were 3 years of careful records. Not the meticulous system her father had used, but thorough enough. The documentation of a man who'd operated his business honestly and kept the evidence of that honesty in a wooden box, because some part of him had known, even when he'd tried not to know, that he was going to need it. She went through it page by page quickly, not reading everything, but reading enough to understand the shape of it. Contracts, correspondence, bank statements. And near the bottom, a letter from a law firm in Tucson, from Harlan Voss. Dated 14 months ago, 4 months before Hendricks lost the ranch. She read it twice. It was carefully worded, the language of a man who understood how to say things without technically saying them. But the substance of it was clear. If you read it with the knowledge she was carrying, Voss was communicating with Hendricks under the pretense of a business inquiry, but what he was actually doing was assessing. Gathering information about the operation's finances, its debts, its vulnerabilities. Asking in the pleasant language of professional correspondence. Exactly the questions a man would ask if he were mapping the terrain before moving on it. "You replied to this?" she asked, holding it up. Hendricks nodded. "I thought it was legitimate business interest. I answered his questions." "You told him about the operation's finances?" "I told him what any honest businessman tells a potential investor." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd been replaying a conversation for over a year. "I didn't know what he was doing with it." She put the letter in her journal. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, "I need you to make a decision." She said it directly, the way she'd said things to Tom Briggs, without softening. "I'm building a case against the people who did this. To you, to my father, to others across this territory. I have documentation. I have a witness statement, and I'm about to go to Flagstaff to present what I have to the Territorial Bank." She held his gaze. "I need your testimony. Written, and if it comes to it, in person. I need you to be willing to say publicly what you just told me privately. He looked at her for a long moment. He's powerful, Hendricks said. Whitaker. He's got connections in Tucson and Flagstaff. Men who owe him. I know. If I put my name on something and it doesn't work. I know, she said again. She wasn't going to pretend the risk wasn't real. She wasn't going to tell him it would be fine, because she didn't know if it would be fine, and he deserved honesty more than comfort. I know what I'm asking. Hendricks looked at the wooden box on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time. My father homesteaded that property, he said finally. 42 years ago. He built the first structure with his own hands. I was born in that house. He looked up. And some man in a good suit with a forged signature took it from me, and I couldn't do a damn thing about it. His voice was controlled, but only barely, with the specific quality of something that had been contained for so long that the container was showing strain. I'll write the statement, and if it comes to standing up in front of someone and saying it to their face, I'll do that too. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly on the wooden box. Thank you, she said. He wrote the statement that night, and it was good, specific, dated, detailed, in the way that only the truth was detailed, with the particular texture of someone describing things they had actually experienced rather than things they were constructing. When he finished, she read it and asked 3 clarifying questions, and then she added it to her journal alongside Tom Briggs's statement and the Voss letter and the card with the CW7 notation. She was building something. She could feel it taking shape the way she felt a good breeding program take shape, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow accumulation of pieces that eventually became more than the sum of their parts. They left Prescott the next morning before dawn. The ride to Flagstaff was 2 days through country that was doing its autumn best, and Adeline spent most of it turning the Voss letter over in her mind. The specific questions he'd asked Hendricks about the operation's finances. What did that tell her about his method? He went in first as an assessment. He gathered the information. Then the machinery moved the forged documents, the creditors claimed the accelerated proceeding. Then Whitaker's company moved on the acquisition. 3 stages. 3 actors, or at least 3 functions, the assessor, the forger, the acquirer. And Voss, at the center of at least 2 of them. She thought about what Wesley had said about Gerald Marsh at the Territorial Bank. He'd legitimized the proceedings. Whether he'd known what he was legitimizing was the question she was going to Flagstaff to answer. They arrived in Flagstaff on a Tuesday morning, and by noon they were sitting across a desk from Gerald Marsh. Howe was in his late 50s, a careful man in a careful suit, with the specific quality of someone who had spent his career managing risk and had developed strong opinions about how it should be done. He looked at them with the assessing neutrality of a banker conducting a preliminary evaluation, and he waited for them to speak. Wesley spoke first, which was the right tactical choice. Marsh knew him, had done business with him, and the credibility came faster through an existing relationship than through a stranger. Gerald, Wesley said, Adeline is Nathaniel Marlowe's daughter. She has information about the foreclosure proceedings on the Marlowe property that I think you need to hear. Marsh looked at her. Miss Marlowe, I'm sorry about your father's passing. Thank you, she said. And I appreciate you seeing us. I'm going to be direct with you because I think direct is the most efficient use of your time and mine. She opened her journal and placed Tom Briggs's statement on the desk in front of him. This is a sworn statement from my father's foreman describing a late-night visit to the ranch 2 weeks before my father's death. A visit by an agent of Harlan Voss, acting on behalf of CW Land Holdings. She placed the card with the notation beside it. This card was found the morning after that visit. This, she placed the Voss letter, is correspondence between Voss and Frank Hendricks, whose ranch was acquired by the same company under nearly identical circumstances 14 months ago. She looked at Marsh directly. I believe the loan documentation used to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Marlowe property was fraudulent. I believe the signature on those documents is not my father's. And I believe this bank processed those proceedings in good faith on the basis of forged paperwork, which means this bank has legal exposure. Marsh had not moved while she laid out the documents. He sat very still, the stillness processing information with great care. and she could see in his face the specific quality of someone whose assessment of a situation was shifting in real time and didn't like where it was shifting to. "That is a very serious allegation," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. Which is why I'm bringing it to you, rather than directly to the territorial authorities, because I believe you were victimized by this as much as my father was, and because I think you'd rather know now than find out the way institutions usually find out about fraud, which is after it's already become a public catastrophe." Marsh looked at Wesley. "She's right," Wesley said simply. Marsh picked up Tom Briggs's statement. He read it the way lawyers and bankers read documents, completely, without expression, without rushing. Then he read the Voss letter. Then he looked at the card. Then he put it all down and folded his hands on his desk and looked at Adeline with an expression she hadn't expected. It was not the expression of a man preparing a defensive dismissal. It was the expression of a man who was furious quietly with the specific fury of someone who had been used. "Harlan Voss," he said, "has presented documentation to this bank on 3 separate occasions in the past 4 years. All 3 were acquisition cases. All 3 proceeded." She felt the information land with a weight she'd been bracing for. "3, she said, "that I'm aware of." He paused. "I am now less certain that I am fully aware." He stood. "I need to pull some files. I'll need an hour." He looked at her. "Will you wait?" "As long as it takes," she said. He left the room, and she sat in the chair across from his empty desk and breathed slowly and looked at the surface of the desk and thought about 3 cases she knew of and what else might be sitting in those files waiting to be found. Wesley leaned toward her. "You all right?" "No," she said honestly. "But that's not the relevant question right now." He almost smiled. Almost. Marsh came back in 53 minutes. He was carrying 4 files. He set them on the desk and sat down and looked at her with the expression he'd been wearing when he left. Controlled fury, the fury of a meticulous man who had discovered his meticulousness had been circumvented. 4 cases, he said. Not 3. Voss presented documentation in 4 separate acquisition proceedings handled by this bank. The Marlowe case, the Hendricks case, a cattle operation in Williams 2 years ago, and a mixed property outside of Benson 18 months ago. He opened the top file. In each case, the documentation appeared complete, signed, and legitimate. In each case, proceedings moved faster than standard. We have a mechanism for expedited proceedings in cases of clear creditor distress, and in each of these cases that mechanism was invoked. He looked up. Someone knew our internal process well enough to invoke it consistently. "Someone who had done business with you before," she said. "Someone who had done business with us before," he confirmed. "Voss has been presenting cases to this bank for 8 years. He established credibility over time. The expedited proceedings didn't look unusual because they came from a source we'd learned to trust. It was elegant in the way that well-constructed crimes were elegant. The patience of it, the long foundation, laying the trust built deliberately, and then spent all at once in a concentrated series of actions. She thought about a man who planned this over years, who was capable of that kind of patience, and felt the cold specificity of understanding what she was actually dealing with. "I need copies of everything in those files," she said. "I need to speak with our legal counsel before I can release documentation," Marsh said, "but I can tell you that if what you're presenting is accurate, this institution has every incentive to cooperate with any investigation that leads to accountability." He paused. "I would like to speak with your attorney." "I don't have one at the moment," she said. "The one I hired in the early proceedings was not helpful." "There is a man in Flagstaff," Marsh said, "named Edward Pruitt. He does territorial law. He is honest, which in my experience is not as common as it should be, and he has dealt with land fraud cases before." He wrote the name on a piece of paper and pushed it across the desk. "Tell him I sent you." She picked up the paper. She looked at the name on it. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh," she said. "Miss Marlowe." He looked at her with the expression of a man calibrating something. "Your father was a good client. A straightforward man who dealt honestly and expected the same in return." A pause. "I should have looked more carefully." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You should have." She said it without cruelty, and without softening the way her father would have said it plainly as a fact, without requiring the other person to feel worse than the fact itself warranted. Marsh accepted it the same way. They found Edward Pruitt that afternoon. He was in his mid-40s, spare and direct, with an office that was organized in the way that suggested someone who worked with a lot of paper and had developed strong opinions about where it all went. He listened to the whole account without interrupting all of it, from the auction, to Briggs, to Hendricks, to the 4 files in Marsh's office, and when she finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for about 15 seconds. "You've been building this case for 8 months without knowing you were building it," he said. "Yes," she said. "The documentation, you have the Briggs statement, the Hendricks statement, the Voss letter, the card notation, that's corroborating evidence. Strong corroborating, but corroborating. What you need is primary evidence." He looked at her. "You need the original documents, the forged loan agreement, the authentic signature comparison. Something that proves the documents are false, not just that the circumstances around them are suspicious." "Those documents are in the files at the Territorial Bank," she said. "The bank's copies, yes. But the originals, or what Voss presented as originals, those would be in the legal record of the foreclosure proceedings, held by the court." He leaned forward. "I can subpoena those records. It'll take 10 days to 2 weeks for the order to process, but once I have the originals, I can get a document examiner to look at that signature." He looked at her. "Do you have anything with your father's authentic signature? Letters, contracts, anything dated before the proceedings?" She reached into her coat and pulled out the last thing she had from her father's desk. A letter he'd written her 3 years ago, the summer she'd started helping him with the notation system. A personal letter she'd folded into the back of her journal the day they'd cleared the ranch and had been carrying ever since. She set it on Pruitt's desk. He looked at it carefully. "May I keep this?" It was the last personal correspondence she had from her father. The last thing he'd written to her directly. She'd read it so many times that she could have recited it from memory, and she didn't need to have the physical paper to know what it said. "Yes," she said. She said it without hesitation, which was the hardest thing she'd done all day, which was saying something. Pruitt looked at her with the expression of a man who understood what she'd just handed him. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I know," she said. She meant it. They were walking out of Pruitt's office into the late afternoon when Wesley's hand came lightly to her elbow, not grabbing, just a touch, alerting. And she stopped. Across the street, just turning away with the speed of someone who'd been watching and had realized they'd been seen, was a man she'd seen before. Not someone she could name. Someone from the auction yard, she thought. Or was it Red Valley? The face was familiar, in the way faces were familiar when you'd registered them without consciously noting them. The background figure who turned out not to be background at all. He was gone around the corner before she could look long enough to be certain. "Did you see him?" she said quietly. "Yes," Wesley said. He said it with the specific flatness of someone who was doing the same calculation she was. Short good coat bay horse tied at the corner post. He was at the auction. "I'm not certain." "I am," she said. "He was near Whitaker's group." She kept walking, kept her pace ordinary, kept her face forward. "We've been followed since Red Valley, or since Prescott." "Probably Prescott," Wesley said. "Whitaker would have assumed we'd go to Hendricks, which means he knows we went to the bank. He'll know by tonight." She processed that as they walked. If Whitaker knew they'd been to Marsh, he'd know they had the 4-case information. He'd know Pruitt was involved. He'd know the subpoena was coming, or would come, which meant he had 10 days to 2 weeks to do something about the documents before a court order could compel their examination. A man as careful as Whitaker would not wait 10 days. "He's going to move on the documents," she said. "He's going to try to move on the documents," Wesley said. "Can Pruitt expedite the subpoena?" "I don't know. We should go back and ask." They turned around. She didn't run. Running attracted attention she couldn't afford, but she walked with the specific purpose of someone who had run out of margin for delay, and Wesley kept pace beside her without comment, and behind them somewhere the man in the good coat was already delivering his report to someone who was going to use it, and the window they had was measured in days now instead of weeks. Pruitt was still in his office. He looked up when they came back in and read their faces before either of them spoke. "What happened?" he said. "We've been followed," Adeline said. "Whitaker knows we were here. He's going to try to interfere with the documents before the subpoena can reach them." She sat down across from his desk. "Can you move faster?" Pruitt was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he reached for a piece of paper and a pen. "The judge who handles territorial land cases in this district is a man named Cowboy. He and I have a professional relationship. If I go to him tonight and represent the urgency-followed party's documented fraud risk of evidence interference, he may authorize an emergency order." He looked up. "It bypasses the standard timeline. It's not guaranteed." "Tonight," she said. "Tonight," he confirmed. He was already writing. "Where are you staying?" She named the boarding house. "I'll send word by 9 o'clock, he said. "One way or the other." They left again, and this time the afternoon had gone, and the early evening light was doing what it did in Flagstaff in the fall, turning everything a color that was beautiful in a way that had no relationship to what was happening to the people living inside it, which Adeline had always thought was one of the more honest things about light. They ate supper at the boarding house without tasting it. At 8:47, a boy knocked on the door with a note from Pruitt. "Judge Calloway has authorized the emergency order. Documents will be held under court seal as of tonight. Examination scheduled for Thursday. Be at my office at 8 in the morning. Bring everything you have." She read it twice. Then she handed it to Wesley without saying anything. He read it, set it on the table, looked at her. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "Will you?" She thought about the letter from her father sitting on Pruitt's desk. She thought about Tom Riggs writing his statement at a livery table with careful, infrequent handwriting. She thought about Hendrix's wooden box and the 14 months he'd been carrying it and not knowing what to do with what was inside. She thought about her father sitting at his desk after the late-night visitor in the lamplight, not reading, not writing, just sitting. Scared, Tom had said. Looking scared. Her father had known something was wrong. He'd known it, and he'd carried it, and he'd died 2 weeks later, and whatever he'd known had died with him, except that it hadn't. It had stayed alive in the things he'd written down, and the system he'd built, and the daughter he'd raised, and the foreman who hadn't been able to stop thinking about it. The things we do in our lives don't end when we end. That was what she understood sitting at a boarding house table in Flagstaff with a court order between her hands. The things we do go on in ways we don't always get to see. "I'll try," she said. She went to her room. She lay down. She closed her eyes. She thought about Thursday and what they were going to find when a document examiner put her father's signature beside the signature on a fraudulent loan agreement and told the truth about what he saw. She thought about what happened after that. And somewhere in the territory, Clayton Whitaker was thinking about it too. That was the thing about a man who planned carefully and patiently over years. He was also capable of planning what to do when his plans started coming apart. He hadn't survived this long by being surprised into paralysis. He was going to move, and she didn't know exactly how, and not knowing was its own particular kind of weight. But the documents were sealed now. The court had them. And in 2 days, the truth inside them was going to be visible to people who had the authority to act on it. She held on to that in the dark of the boarding house room, while the night pressed in around her. 2 days. She just needed to get through 2 more days. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and counted the things she knew. The way she'd once counted breeding records methodically, without sentiment, looking for the pattern underneath the data. The court order was in place. The documents were sealed. Pruitt had a judge behind him, and Marsh had the bank's institutional interest behind him, and none of that meant anything if Whitaker moved faster than they could respond. She got up at 4 and dressed in the dark and sat at the small table by the window and wrote in her journal until the light came. She wrote about her father. Not facts this time. She had 6 pages of facts already. She wrote about who he was. The way he'd stood beside a difficult horse without impatience, waiting for the animal to come to him rather than going to the animal, because he said that fear needed space to resolve itself, and the worst thing you could do was crowd it. The way he'd reviewed his ledgers at the end of every month, not because he didn't trust his own figures, but because he said the act of checking was its own form of respect for the work, for the numbers, for the people whose livelihoods depended on accuracy. The way he'd said her name, when she got something right, quiet and specific, the single word carrying everything pride could carry, when it didn't need to announce itself. She wrote until she had to stop, because continuing meant crying, and she didn't have time to cry today. Then she closed the journal, put it in her coat, and went to find Wesley. He was already downstairs, coffee made, sitting at the boarding house table, with the particular stillness of a man who had also not slept and had made his peace with it. He looked at her when she came in and didn't ask how she'd rested. "Pruitt's office at 8, she said. "I know. I want to walk past the courthouse first." He understood immediately. Check whether anyone's watching it. Check whether Whitaker has moved. They walked to the courthouse in the early morning quiet of Flagstaff, keeping to the side of the street that gave them sightlines without putting them directly in front of anything, and Adeline scanned the surroundings with the focused attention she usually brought to reading a horse, looking for the wrong thing in the right place. The thing that was present when it should be absent, or absent when it should be present. There was a man on the bench across from the courthouse steps. I wasn't doing anything specific. He was sitting, which was a reasonable thing to do on a bench with his hat pulled down and his coat collar up, and a newspaper. He wasn't reading held in front of him in the way of someone who wanted to look occupied without actually being occupied. He'd been there long enough that the bench's other early morning occupants had come and gone around him. "Don't look directly," she said quietly. "I see him," Wesley said. "He's watching the entrance. Whitaker knows the order went through. He's tracking who goes in and out." Wesley kept walking steady, unhurried, the pace of two people with somewhere to be that was not here. He can't interfere with a court seal, but he can watch who's building the case and calculate his options. What options does he have left? Fewer than he'd like. A pause. Which makes him more dangerous, not less. Careful men with fewer options make decisions that less careful men wouldn't. She thought about that for the rest of the walk to Pruitt's office. Pruitt was already there when they arrived, which told her he also hadn't slept. He had the 4 bank files on his desk, copies he'd obtained from Marsh late the previous evening, and beside them a folder of correspondence that he'd been working through. He looked up when they came in and said without preamble, "Sit down. There's something you need to know before we go to the examination." She sat. "I went through the Benson case file last night," he said. "The property outside of Benson that Marsh mentioned, the 4th case. The one I didn't have full information on yet." He opened the folder. The registered owner of that property before the acquisition was a man named Samuel Greer. Cattle operation, mid-sized, established for 20 years. He looked at her. Samuel Greer died 4 months before the foreclosure proceedings began. Sudden cardiac episode. No prior warning. The air in the room changed. She heard what he was saying. She heard all of it. "My father," she said. Her voice came out level. She made it level. "And Samuel Greer," Pruitt said. "Both healthy men in their 50s. Both dead of sudden heart episodes. Both with large, previously undisclosed debts appearing within months of their deaths." He closed the folder. "I don't have evidence of anything beyond financial fraud. I want to be clear about that. What I have is a pattern that requires investigation by people with the authority to investigate it." He looked at her steadily. "But I wanted you to know before we walked into that examination room today what the full shape of this might be." She sat very still. She had thought for 8 months that what had happened to her father was financial predation. She had thought about forged documents and manipulated proceedings and a careful man's stolen legacy. She had thought about these things and been furious about them and built her case against them. She had not let herself think the other thing. She was thinking it now. "One case could be coincidence," Wesley said quietly from beside her. "2 cases is a pattern," Pruitt said. "Which is why I'm telling you and why I've sent a letter this morning to the federal marshal's office in Prescott." He paused. "What we're doing today is about the financial fraud. That case I can build and I can win. The other question is for someone with different authority than mine." Adeline sat with the weight of it. She had come into this room carrying a case about stolen land and forged documents. She was leaving it carrying something larger and darker, something she couldn't unknow, Now that she knew it, and she had to make a decision about where to put that, how to carry it, how to keep it from collapsing the clarity she needed for the next several hours. She put it in the same place she'd been putting unbearable things for 8 months. Not a way she'd learned it didn't go away. Nothing that true ever went away, but down below the working level, where it couldn't interfere with the task that needed doing right now. Later. She would open that door later. "What time is the examination?" she said. 10 o'clock, Pruitt said. "Then we have 2 hours. Tell me what to expect." The document examiner was a man named Aldous Crane, brought in from the territorial capital, whose specific professional expertise was the authentication of historical documents and the identification of fraudulent ones. He was 70 years old and moved with the deliberateness of someone who had spent decades doing precise work and had no intention of rushing any of it for anyone. He had been working since 8. When they entered the examination room at 10, he was standing at the table with a magnifying glass and his back to the door, and he finished what he was doing before he turned around. "Mr. Pruitt," he said. Then he looked at Adeline. "Miss Marlowe." "You know who I am," she said. "I know whose letter I've been comparing to," he said. He set the magnifying glass down on the table carefully in the specific spot he intended it to occupy. "Sit down, please." They sat. He remained standing, which she understood was not about authority, but about the fact that he'd been sitting for 2 hours and his back needed a change. "I have examined 3 documents this morning," he said. "The letter you provided as an authenticated sample of Nathaniel Marlowe's signature dated approximately 3 years ago. The loan agreement filed with this court in connection with the Marlowe foreclosure proceedings dated 14 months ago, and a secondary agreement attached to that filing." He looked at them. "I will tell you what I found." She put her hands flat on her knees under the table. "The letter is authentic," he said. "The signature is consistent with natural variation, shows no signs of construction, and the ink aging is consistent with the stated date." He paused. "The loan agreement is not authentic." The room was very quiet. "The signature on the loan agreement was produced by someone with considerable skill," Crane said. "It is not an amateur forgery. The person who made it had studied the authentic signature carefully and reproduced the general form accurately. To an untrained eye, or to someone conducting a routine document review without specific reason for suspicion, it would pass." He picked up the magnifying glass again, looked through it at the document on the table. "But the pressure pattern is wrong. When a person signs their own name, the pressure of the pen varies naturally with the individual's habitual motion. The variation in this signature is present, but it is imposed. It is the variation of someone who has learned where to apply pressure rather than someone for whom pressure variation is unconscious habit." He set the magnifying glass down. "Additionally, the ink composition is inconsistent with the stated date of the document. The paper is consistent, but the ink aged differently than it should have if the document were 3 years old as claimed. It is closer to 14 months old." Pruitt was writing. He had been writing since Crane started speaking, his pen moving quickly across the paper, getting every word. "You're saying the document was created approximately 14 months ago," Adeline said. "I'm saying the ink evidence is consistent with that timeline," Crane said carefully, with the precision of a man who had been an expert witness before and understood the difference between saying what the evidence showed and saying more than the evidence showed. "I cannot say with certainty that it was created at that time. I can say that it was not created 3 years ago as the filing claims." "Will you testify to that?" Pruitt asked. "I will testify to exactly what I've told you," Crane said. "No more and no less." "That's everything we need," Pruitt said. Adeline looked at the loan agreement on the table. The document that had ended her father's ranch. The document that had been used to initiate proceedings that had moved with suspicious speed through a system that had been prepared to receive them. The document with a signature that her father had never made on paper that had been aged with someone's careful attention to the appearance of legitimacy. She had known for 8 months. She had known with the certainty of a person who had spent 15 years working alongside a man and knew the texture of him, the specific way he moved through the world, the things he would and would not do, and why. She had known and been told she was wrong, and been managed and dismissed and redirected until she'd started in the darkest part of some of those 4 in the morning nights to wonder if grief was doing to her what everyone said it was doing. It wasn't grief. She had been right. She stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Crane." He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite an expression, more like the acknowledgement of a man who had seen difficult things in his work and understood the weight of a moment like this one. He nodded once. They walked out of the courthouse into the Flagstaff morning and stood in the street, and Pruitt said, "I'm going to file for an emergency injunction against CW Land Holdings and file the fraud complaint with the territorial court today. I'll have the documentation to the federal marshal's office by end of week." He looked at her. "The property seizure will take time to untangle legally, these things always do. But the case is solid. Crane's testimony plus the corroborating evidence, plus the bank files, plus Briggs and Hendricks, that's not a circumstantial case anymore. That's a case." She nodded. "Whitaker is going to know by end of day," Pruitt said. "He already knows," Wesley said. They all looked across the street. The man on the bench was gone. In his place at the end of the block, Clayton Whitaker was standing beside a very good horse in a very good coat, watching them with the expression of a man who had run the calculation and was arriving at a number he didn't like. How was 50 yards away? Close enough to see. Too far to speak to, which meant whatever happened right now was going to happen in full sight of anyone on the Flagstaff Street at 10:30 in the morning, with no privacy for either party. He tipped his hat. It was the gesture of a man who had decided that the most powerful position available to him right now was the appearance of unconcern, who had spent years making difficult things look easy, and was calling on every bit of that skill to stand in the street and acknowledge the people who had just unraveled 3 years of careful work as though they were simply acquaintances he'd happened to encounter. Adeline looked at him across the 50 yards. Then she turned her back on him and said to Pruitt, "How do I get the breeding records back?" Pruitt blinked. The speed of the transition from the gravity of what they'd just done to the practical question of what came next took him a half-second to follow. "The records are property of the ranch, which is held by CW Land Holdings pending the injunction. Once the injunction is in place, the holdings are frozen. After the fraud judgment, the acquisitions made through fraudulent means are subject to reversal." He paused. "It's not fast, but it's possible." "How long?" "Months. Possibly longer, depending on how Whitaker's attorneys fight it." "What can I do to make it faster?" "You can cooperate with every aspect of the investigation, provide everything you have, and trust the process." He looked at her. "And you can accept that justice in territorial courts moves at the speed of territorial courts, which is not the speed any of us would choose." She breathed. "All right. Miss Marlowe." He said her name the way Crane had, with the weight of the moment. "You did something very difficult very well. Don't lose sight of that while you're waiting for the next thing." She didn't answer that. She didn't have the words for it right now, and she wasn't going to use words she didn't mean. They rode back to Carter Ranch 2 days later. The injunction had been filed. Whitaker's attorneys had appeared fast-polished, expensive, exactly as expected, and Pruitt had met them with the Crane report, and the 4 bank files, and Briggs and Hendricks's statements, and the Voss letter, and the card notation, and the expensive attorneys had gone quiet in the specific way that expensive attorneys went quiet when they understood the shape of what they were facing. Harlan Voss had not appeared. That absence, Pruitt said, was interesting. A man who disappeared when his client's legal exposure became real was either preparing to run or preparing to make a deal. Either way, it was interesting. She thought about that on the ride home. She thought about a lot of things on the ride home, the 2 days in Flagstaff, the examination room, Crane's careful, precise language, the loan agreement on the table with the wrong pressure pattern, and the ink that was 14 months old. She thought about her father in his study in the lamplight with Tom Briggs watching from outside and a scared look on his face. She thought about Samuel Greer and what Pruitt had sent to the federal marshal's office and what might happen when people with the right authority started asking the right questions. She thought about all of it, and she let herself feel all of it, the grief and the fury and the complicated thing that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, the specific sensation of having carried something heavy for a long time and setting it down and finding that the muscles still ached even though the weight was gone. Wesley rode beside her and didn't fill the silence with things she didn't need, and that was one of the things she was going to remember, she thought, when she thought about these weeks later. The quality of his presence. The way he'd known consistently when to speak and when not to. They were an hour from Carter Ranch when she said, "You didn't have to do any of this." "No," he agreed. "You had your own operation to run, your own time and money to account for." "That's true." "Why?" she said. Not the way she'd asked it in the kitchen weeks ago, looking for the catch. Differently this time. Genuinely. I was quiet for a moment. "Because your father told me 4 years ago that his daughter understood horses better than anyone he'd ever trained, and that she was going to do something worth watching." He paused. "I paid attention to that. When I saw you at the auction standing there, the way you were standing with everything that had happened visible in your face, if you knew how to look, I thought about what he said, and I thought about what you were about to lose, and I made a decision." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "You decided to get involved." "I decided to be useful," he said. "There's a difference." She thought about that difference for the last hour of the ride, turning it over in her mind, the way she turned things over, examining the edges of it, seeing what it was made of. When Carter Ranch came into view, Rosewood heard them coming before they reached the paddock. The mare was at the fence when they arrived, ears forward, pressing her nose through the rails in the specific way that meant she'd been listening for a particular set of sounds and had been waiting for them to arrive. Adeline dismounted and went straight to her. She put her arms around the mare's neck and stood there for a moment, in the particular completeness of someone who had been away from something they loved and had come back to find it exactly as they'd left it, changed by nothing except their own absence. "All right," she said quietly. "I'm back." Rosewood leaned into her warm and steady and unhurried the way she always had. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind, the kind where the significant thing has already happened, and what remains is the patient waiting for the process to do what processes do. Pruitt wrote twice a week with updates. The injunction held. Whitaker's attorneys filed objections that were answered and overruled. The federal marshal's office in Prescott had opened a separate investigation, the specific nature of which Pruitt communicated in careful language that told her they were looking at the deaths and not just the fraud. She worked the breeding program, the way she'd told Wesley she would, systematically building the temperament documentation alongside the physical records, cross-referencing, back through 3 years of existing data to build a foundation that the next generation of animals could stand on. She spent 3 weeks with the young stallion who'd been mishandled and brought him through the defensive pattern into something that was genuinely responsive and cooperative. And when she rode him for the first time at the end of those 3 weeks, Wesley watched from the fence and said nothing, which was exactly the right response. Danny learned fast. He was the kind of person who paid attention when he was being taught and asked questions that showed he'd actually heard what he was told. And by the end of the first month, he was handling the daily decisions of the program with a competence that freed her to work on the things that needed her specific knowledge rather than competent general management. She fell into the rhythm of the ranch, the way she fell into any rhythm that made sense gradually. Then completely, until it was simply the shape of her days, rather than a new thing she was adjusting to. In December, Pruitt sent a letter that was different from the others. She read it at the kitchen table, and her hands went still on the paper. Harlan Voss had made a deal with the federal marshal's office. A complete account of the scheme, the assessment methodology, the document construction, the financial mechanisms, the timeline of every acquisition in exchange for a reduced sentence, and the agreement that his testimony would be used to prosecute Whitaker. Every acquisition. There were 11 of them, not 7. 11 properties in 5 years across 3 territories with a methodology so refined by the end that Voss had been able to complete the paperwork for the Marlowe case in a single night. She read that and sat very still for a long moment. 11 families, 11 operations, 11 sets of people who had stood where she'd been standing, who had fought what she'd been fighting, most of whom would never know because they'd run out of fight before anyone had known to tell them what they were actually fighting. She put the letter down, picked it up again, near the end, in Pruitt's careful, measured language. The Marshals' investigation has found evidence consistent with the theory that both Nathaniel Marlowe and Samuel Greer received visits from Voss in which they were presented with fraudulent debt instruments and threatened with immediate legal action. The Marshal's office believes the shock of these visits combined with the specific nature of the confrontation may have contributed to both deaths. They have requested that this portion of the investigation be conducted under federal jurisdiction. She folded the letter. She sat with it for a long time. Wesley came in from the yard and saw her face, and sat down across from her without speaking, and she handed him the letter and watched him read it. When he looked up, she said, "He killed my father. The investigation will determine." Wesley. She said his name the way she said true things. "He killed my father." I was quiet for a moment. He didn't argue with her. He knew her well enough by now to know the difference between a statement that needed challenging and a statement that needed witnessing. "Yes," he said. "I think he did." She breathed. She breathed again. "Then I need to make sure it matters," she said. "Everything that's in Pruitt's files, everything Voss is going to testify to, everything I've built in that journal. It needs to matter for the other 10 families, not just mine. I need to give Pruitt everything I have about the other cases, the names I found, the patterns. I need to write to Bauer in New Mexico. I need to contact every person I can identify who was part of this operation, because the only way this means anything is if it's complete." "That's going to take months," Wesley said. "I know. You're going to do it anyway." "Yes." He looked at her. "I'll help." She looked back at him. This man she had known for 4 months now, who had bought her horse and handed back the reins and offered her a job and ridden to Prescott and Flagstaff and sat in a boarding house waiting for a court order and read a federal marshal's letter across a kitchen table at Carter Ranch and said without hesitation that he'd help with whatever came next. "I know," she said. "That's not nothing to me." Something happened in his face. The quickest possible version of what it was there and gone, but she saw it. She saw it, and she held it, and she went back to work. In February, Clayton Whitaker was arrested in Tucson. The territorial newspaper ran the story on the front page. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit financial predation across 3 territories. The federal investigation into the deaths of Nathaniel Marlowe and Samuel Greer was referenced in the 3rd paragraph in careful legal language that said everything without technically saying anything until the evidence was complete. She read the article once. Then she went out to the paddock and stood with Rosewood in the February cold, and she told the mare what had happened, because she had always talked to horses the way other people talk to trusted friends, and Rosewood had been with her through all of it, every moment from the auction yard to this one. The mare listened with the steady, warm attention she'd always brought to Adeline's voice, and Adeline told her about Pruitt and Crane and Marsh and Tom Briggs and Hendricks and the 11 families and the federal marshal's office and the letter in December, and what it had said about a man visiting a ranch after dark with a leather case and a forged document. She told her about her father sitting at his desk in the lamplight looking scared. She told her that it was over now, that the man responsible was going to answer for it, that the records, her father's 30 years of careful documentation, were going to come back because the injunction reversal was moving through the courts, and Pruitt believed it would complete by spring, and when it did, every piece of knowledge her father had built and preserved was going to come home. Rosewood breathed against her neck. "I was right about you," she said. She wasn't talking to the horse anymore. She was talking to the man she'd been talking to in her mind for 8 months, the conversation that grief ran underneath everything else, the one she'd never get to finish because he wasn't there. "What you built, it's still here. It's still ours. They took the land, and they took the paper, and they thought that was everything, but they were wrong." She pressed her forehead against Rosewood's neck. They were wrong about what the most important thing was. The most important thing was not in any ledger. It was not on any shelf in any notation system in any set of records that a man with a lawyer's case and a forged signature could put in a box and carry away. The most important thing was what her father had given her before he could give her anything else. Not the horses, not the records, not the land. The understanding, the patience, the capacity to look at something carefully and see it truly and act on what she saw without waiting for someone else to tell her it was real. That was what Clayton Whitaker had not understood about her, and it was the thing that had undone him. He'd looked at a woman standing alone at an auction with $42 and a horse she was breaking her heart to sell, and he'd seen a loose end. Something to tie off. Something that could be managed with a low offer and a rumor about bloodline records and the routine pressure of a system that had always worked in his favor. He hadn't seen who she was. Her father had. Wesley had. And she had seen it herself on the good days and the bad days and the 4 in the morning days and all the days in between, when seeing it was the only thing keeping her moving in the right direction. She knew her own worth. She had always known it. And she had never not at the auction, not in 8 months of fighting, not in any moment when the system had arranged itself against her and told her she was wrong. She had never once let anyone else decide what that worth was. Spring came in March. The way it came to Arizona territory, suddenly with the specific warmth of a place that had been cold and then decided all at once to be otherwise. Rosewood foaled her first Carter Ranch colt in the second week of March, a strong chestnut with his mother's confirmation and a blaze that ran from his forehead almost to his muzzle, so like his dam that Adeline stood at the stall door and laughed for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember. Wesley came to see what she was laughing at. He stood beside her at the stall door and looked at the foal and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Name him." She looked at the foal. She looked at Rosewood. She thought about her father standing in a spring storm 20 years ago, watching a chestnut foal take its first careful steps, choosing a name because of the color of a coat in morning light, and the idea that something could be built to last. "Marlowe," she said. Wesley looked at her. Something in his face that was not the quickest possible version this time, that did not disappear before it could commit to itself, that stayed. "That's the right name," he said. She looked back at the foal, and she felt it the particular quality of a moment that was not an ending and not a beginning, but something more honest than either the moment where the story that had been broken open found its new shape, and the shape was good, and it was hers. The Marlowe name was going to mean something in Arizona territory again. It was already starting to. And the woman who had stood alone in an auction yard with $42 and a breaking heart, who had refused to let anyone decide her worth, who had fought for 8 months in the dark, and then walked into the light and kept walking. That woman was standing in a stall doorway in the March warmth, watching her father's legacy take its first steps into a future he'd built without knowing it. And she was not alone, and she was not finished, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be. That was the truth of it. That was all of it. And it was enough.